Hi. I'm Chris Enchapsky. I'm a Firefox telemetry engineer and data steward at Mozilla, the place that makes Firefox. I'm here to talk about data and responsibility. Not quite as funny, sorry. It may surprise you to learn that Firefox collects data. If it doesn't, it might surprise you to learn how much data it collects. If you take any Firefox newer than version 38 and navigate to about:telemetry, you'll see exactly what Firefox collects and how often it gets sent to Mozilla. We try to make it easy for users to see what's being done on their behalf. And as for how much data that adds up to, well, that's a graph of bytes per minute. There's exponential notation on the y-axis. Summing it up, for release channel Firefox alone, we receive over 100 terabytes of data each day, a little less on weekends. So yeah, we collect data. Data can be used for bad things. It can track you across the web, it can be exposed in data breaches, and can be used to target harassment and other attacks at people online and in the real world. Given how much of our users' lives are lived within Firefox, we have a heavy responsibility to bear when it comes to data. Think about it. Browsers have access to credit cards, addresses, downloaded videos, uploaded videos, passwords, tax information. If you want a nightmare scenario, think about what a machine learning algorithm could do with a full capture of your web browsing history. Not just URLs, form contents, recordings. One thing that's great about Mozilla is that we don't collect or want to collect this data. We do want to know how many bookmarks you have, but not for where they are. We want to know how many tabs you have open, but not what you're doing in them. We want to know how long it takes for your click to be processed by the page, but not why it was spent taking so long. And this is because we don't collect data about our users. We're collecting data about Firefox. And this is usage, not users. This practice is exemplified most directly by one of our core design decisions in our data collection system, called Telemetry. We have an ID in the profile of Firefox that uniquely identifies data collected by that Firefox while it is running that profile. We use this to deduplicate incoming data, to identify anomalies, and to build a longitudinal picture of how that Firefox is running over its lifetime. But we make no effort to identify whether another profile on that same machine or another install on another machine are the same user. We're interested in Firefox, remember, not whether the same humans using it at work and at home. All we know is that there's one Firefox with 11 tabs open that is used heavier on weekends, and another Firefox with 4 tabs open that is used heavier on weekdays. It could be the same user. Who knows? We even have a way for a user to sync their browsing data between the two browsers, called, imaginatively, Firefox Sync. But Firefox Sync doesn't know this ID. It doesn't have to, so it doesn't get to. This is an ingrained cultural approach of data collection at Mozilla, and it helps us out with the GDPR. Now, for those who don't know, the GDPR is a piece of European law that regulates how organizations are allowed to deal with data if that data comes from an EU person. They can be sitting in this Waterloo, but if they're from the Waterloo in Belgium, think Napoleon or ABBA, then it protects them and their data. Specifically, it requires that organizations write their privacy policies clearly and with specific mention of what is being collected, how it's being collected, and with whom it's being shared. It also requires that an organization give a user their data if they ask for it, and if that user asks that organization to destroy that data, the organization must comply. It also provides a legal definition of personal information as something that pertains to an individual. Email addresses and phone numbers certainly apply here. So do IP addresses. But what about hardware fingerprints? What about browsing history? We may have to wait for the first couple of rounds of court cases to find out about those. But before we continue, a quick word. The GDPR has legal ramifications for your products and projects. So if you're building something and some EU user might use it, please seek representation. I'll be speaking about legal things very casually and generally. None of this should be considered legal advice, just friendly advice. So you might have noticed that in the flood of emails last May around GDPR Compliance Day, that everyone updated their privacy policies. You might have noticed that you didn't receive one from Mozilla or one from Firefox. This is because Mozilla is a keener. Not only did we complete the assignment, we handed it in early and did extra credit. So Years ago, we developed our data privacy principles to guide our cultural approach to data at Mozilla, and 7 months before GDPR Compliance Day, we updated our Firefox privacy notice. 3 months before that, we developed a data collection process that embeds documentation, justification, and information in a way that not only exceeds what the GDPR asked for, but turned out to be really helpful to our organization. And I think you'll find it helpful too. So say you're a Firefox engineer, and our community managers advise me to tell you that if you aren't, you can be real soon. And you just added a cool new feature. You want to measure how fast it is, how often it's used, and whether it leads to a higher crash rate when run on computers with some rare NVIDIA graphics card. So this means you want to collect data. Well, what kind of data? For data collected in Firefox, we have identified 4 categories with increasing levels of concern and process. From our example, the speed of your feature is deeply technical. It doesn't identify anyone, and it doesn't pertain to browsing history or even how the user is using Firefox. So that's category 1, technical data. Measurements in this category are things like how long database connections take to spin up or what the hit rate was in the network cache. How often your feature is used is something that comes from users using Firefox. So some users will use your feature more and some will use it less. So that's category 2, interaction data. Collections in this category include how many tabs you open, which buttons you press on browser dialogues, and how many shortcut keys you use. These 2 categories are exactly what I mean about collecting data about usage, not users. But we do have other categories. Category 3 is web activity data. Like it says on the tin, this is people's browsing histories, even if it's just the domain name. Category 4 is highly sensitive data. This is email addresses, form data, IP addresses, names. We treat data collections in these categories differently, extra cautiously. There's only ever been one instance that I know of where we recorded category 4 data. It was a user survey, and we implemented a double opt-in to make sure that users knew what they were signing up for and weren't giving us their data accidentally. But back to our example. So your feature is far enough along in implementation now that you probably have a patch and review, and it's time to get permission to collect the data you want. You do this by filling out a form, and it is a good form. There are 10 questions, most of them focused on the unique task of forcing you to justify to yourself that this data is needed. We ask, what questions do you hope to answer with this data? Because you absolutely need to have a concrete question. Worries about crash rates on NVIDIA, wanting to ensure that your feature is being used, these are valid questions, so we may proceed. Then we ask, why do we need to answer those questions? Explain why we should bother. Well, if crash rates spike, that's not good for users, and if the feature isn't being used, we should ditch it, so, all right. Then we ask, what did you consider instead of collecting data, and why didn't that work? Do your research show your work? Crash rates already come in by 2 other mechanisms, so maybe we don't need to work that out here, but there's no other way to measure how fast this feature is. So let's keep talking about that. And then we ask, can current data answer this already? Prove you've already tried. Your feature's new, so there isn't current data, but maybe there's already something measuring how fast the code that runs your feature is. Maybe. Look it up and get back to me. Towards the end, we ask, how will you analyze this data? Show you have committed resources to do something with this data that you want us all to collect. Us, we have a bug filed already to analyze the uptake data and a number in mind of what success looks like. So we've got it covered. Well done. All these questions take the default posture of don't collect. And this is a principle we like to call lean data. Prove to yourself, then to us, that data, the last resort, is the only way to proceed. And then explain why. Once you've filled out your form, there's a checklist that a data steward like me needs to go through. There must be public documentation so that users can find it. There must be a control mechanism to turn it off so that vulnerable users can do so. If the collection is permanent, some individual must commit to monitoring it over time, and if it isn't, identify an individual responsible for removing it when it expires. If anything fails a test, it goes back for review. If I, the data steward reviewing this, am unsure about any of it, I am under strict instructions to bring in legal and trust to make the final call. But most of the time, the fact that we have this process and the word choice in the questions and the cultural approach of lean data at Mozilla combined to make it so that this form is more documentation than anything else. Any data collection that would be suspect, that could be problematic, probably didn't even get proposed because the person thinking they needed it found a better way, a way using available data, or less data, or no data. Now, you're probably not building a browser, so exactly how much of this can you be reasonably expected to adopt? And though helping users is nice and all, didn't I mention a part where this helps the organization? It's okay to be a little selfish when you're listening to someone drone on about process. It's fine. So let's take it piece by piece. One way categorizing your data helps is by giving your organization a common vocabulary of how to discuss data. Is this data anonymous usage statistics you're monitoring to make sure performance doesn't regress? Or is this data destined for a customer database so that you can charge their credit card and ship them a product? Both are data, but you can see that you might want to treat the customer data rather more carefully. Another way that it helps is by minimizing risk. Under the eye of the GDPR, you already need to categorize things into two piles, personal and not, but those are very general. By having categories specific to your project or product, you make it harder to miss something and fall out of compliance. Written correctly, your categories might save you. Now, within Firefox, data categories are especially useful for speeding up data collection review, but why should you adopt the review process? Well, by using the review process to selectively apply organizational friction, you can guide people to collect data in better ways. For example, our data collection form is much easier to fill out if you're using Firefox Telemetry, because the documentation is written for you and the expiration and opt-out mechanisms are built in and well known by users. We want to encourage people to use telemetry over writing their own system, and the data collection review has been a useful tool to that end. And another way that the data collection review is helpful not only to users and will be helpful to your organizations is in the way that it is helpful to future you. This is something I like to call data archaeology. I'm trying to make that term a thing. Let me show you an example. So say you get an alert. This is a real alert. FX tab switch update MS suddenly changed in the builds released on Tuesday. It used to look like the black line, and now it looks like the red line. It shifted left somewhat. Is that good? I mean, the values are more likely to be lower. Is lower better? These are normalized as proportions, so maybe there are just fewer high-value values now? I mean, who would know these things? What do we do? Well, with the data collection review, I know there's public documentation about this metric, so I pull it up. It links me to the review form, which explains that this is a critical performance metric. Inside the review, though, there's the person who committed to monitor this probe over time, so I call them up. Turns out it's good news. We made tab switching faster, and this is confirmation that the improvements we saw locally are now being enjoyed by users around the world. It's a time to celebrate, not to panic. All is well, thanks to the documentation. I'm a bit of a nerd. Fine, okay, I'm in the right room. If I'm lucky, I've intrigued you with the promise of lesser risks and greater rewards. But let's not fool ourselves into thinking there's enough information in these slides for you to actually do anything about it. Luckily, Mozilla is here to help. In a strange twist of fate, a mere 3 weeks after this talk was accepted, Mozilla decided to launch leandatapractices.org, which covers more or less the same ground as this talk while formalizing it into checklists and worksheets and supporting documents to help you create your own lean data process. It's one of the quirks of working for Mozilla that I had no idea that this website was coming. I learned about it in the news after launch, like the rest of the world. I've since had the time to read through most of the material, and it's really good. I mean, it's designed to be helpful no matter the size of your organization, or the types of data you collect, or the reasons you collect them. So please do go to leandatapractices.org and check it out. Like const correctness, accessibility, localization, and diversity and inclusion, the best time to get started on this was years ago. The second best time is now. With that, my time is done. Thank you. There's lots more I could talk about. I mean, like how we throw away raw data within months and how we use friction to push for data collection that automatically expires and how we use the Firefox Public Data Project to give data back to the world while still maintaining some control over the stories it can tell. But 15 minutes is probably a decent limit to how much I should be allowed to talk without interruption. So yeah, if you have any comments or questions about this talk or other things Firefox and Mozilla, please feel free to catch me around the conference or reach out to me by email. Thank you very much for listening.